I thought the first thing we do is just go down the line and introduce everybody and let them tell what they've done in the industry.
Well, I actually had the distinction of being the lead programmer on the last coin-operated title. Oh, my name is Aron Hightower. I'm new at this. I've never been on one of these panels before, but I'm one of the most recent Atari coin-op guys. So I was the lead programmer on San Francisco Rush 2049 coin-op. So
Nice.
arcade driving game.
Nice.
Thanks. And had a, for me, so that's who I am. I guess I go to Franz.
Hi, I'm Franz Lanzinger. So I was just thinking about this. I've worked for Atari at 4 different companies. So I worked at Atari Coin-Op back in the 80s, 82 to 84. And then at Tengen in 89 to 90. And then at Bitmasters, which was my own company, but we did contract work for Atari. And then I worked with Aron in 2000 on the same team for a brief time. At that time it was called Midway, but they still released their coin-op games under the Atari label.
Hi, I'm Bob Smith. I was at Atari, did video pinball for Atari, and then a few of us took off and formed a Magic. And did a number of games for Magic, Star Voyager, Riddle of the Sphinx, Dragonfire, Moonsweeper, and Star Wars. And I haven't left the games industry, but I won't bore you with the rest of the list. But I'm still in the games industry. It's a brand new company.
I'm Roger Hector. I started with Atari in '76, and I guess we'll talk about stories from Atari, but also I was a design engineer, artist, creative guy, and came up with quite a lot of game designs and game concepts, and also created my own development company, and then started up a little division within the Disney company, which is their current interactive group. Ran Sega technical development along with Steve down there doing Sonic the Hedgehog, and produced games with EA, like the very first John Madden game and that kind of thing. So anyway, I'm still in the games business, working currently with another real old-timer, a guy named Al Alcorn, who's a guy that invented Pong. He and I are working on a little game project together, so there'll be more on that later.
And I'm John Seghers. I joined Atari in '81, was there until Joel took over in '84. Developed Real Sport Soccer, Gremlins, unreleased Atari Arena, and after that, later worked on the Nintendo 8-bit title. Spent several years at Microsoft, part of that in games, and then in the early 2000s, spent 5 years in a startup doing cell phone games. So I've been sort of in and out of the industry, the games industry, and I'm sure I'll be back in it again.
Hi, I'm Steve Woita. I left Apple Computer to go to Atari, and part of that was because of Keithen Hayenga left and went to Atari, who also worked at Apple at the time. And so I left Apple, went to Atari, and worked on about 4 Atari 2600 games. And that's kind of what I did at Atari.
Bob Polaro. Did a few games. No, I started out at Commodore doing games on the Commodore PET. Then I went to Atari programming for the 800, and I did a bunch of basic games. And then they said they had enough of those, so I might as well bone up on the Atari 2600. So I did. I started off doing Stunt Cycle, which was a 2K game, and then they shelved it. So then I worked on Real Sports Volleyball, and they shelved that. So then then they asked us to work on. Todd Fry and I were asked to work on Defender and Pac-Man, and I was designing Defender and he was designing Pac-Man, and they asked me to do Pac-Man. I said, I was already designing Defenders. So I picked Defender and, it happened to Todd, right? So I did Defender, and then they started the Real Sports Volleyball design, and then they brought back Real Sports Volleyball that I designed a while back, but I gave them a round ball then. And then I released Sun Cycle way later when Atari2600.com started bringing back some cards. So it's, now I'm doing cell phone games, mostly Android operating system stuff.
I probably should say what games they were that I worked on. Taz, Quadrun, Asterix, and Garfield, and that was about it. I'm gonna keep doing that as I start doing it.
Yeah, just around
Middle-aged microphones.
That's right.
Fight games. I'm Nick Omarzu. It was Chris back in Atari days, but I changed my name 20 years ago. I've gotten used to it. I did a couple Sesame Street cartridges, and it seems like I did kids games and oddities. Good Luck Charlie Brown was one of the kids games, and then Pepsi Invaders, which is another one of those oddities. And then there's another cartridge that is based on Big Bird. I'll leave it to your imagination. I don't think I can talk about it because they'd have me killed. But I did a little stint with strategic simulations, but afterwards, and worked for Williams doing coin ops before Atari, and I'm kind of far removed from the industry at this point.
Hi, I'm Keithen. I wanted to work with better graphics in the 2600, so I'm actually one of the few people that wanted to work on the 5200. The only thing I got released while I was at Atari was Real Sports Baseball, which is pretty good. But I've got something to announce, and that is that next time I'm on this panel, we'll be able to say that Tempest was finally finished and will be coming out and being published by Atari Age magazine. So next time there'll be two things to mention.
I think what we usually do is just like start doing a question and answer thing. It seems to kind of spiral into a nice kind of dialogue. So I don't know if there's any questions, start that off now. I think. You got any questions, Bob?
If there aren't any questions, we're going to have to do a little skit up here. So.
Whenever you guys do a game like Pac-Man or something,
So the question was, when we were given code games like Pac-Man or something like that to work on, did they give us the original code for the games? And I think that would be a pretty resounding no for the most part.
Basically, they said to do a coin-op conversion, and they brought in the arcade machine, and we got to play it to get the gameplay, but we had to rewrite from scratch. We didn't even get any graphics or anything. Of course, the graphics were pretty low at that time.
I can tell you a little story about how Atari got Pac-Man. There was a relationship between Namco and Atari that had been really established through their coin-op businesses, and there was a time when Namco decided to try and market 3 coin-op games that they had created, and they didn't have a lot of sophisticated sales pitch associated with this, but they sent 3 games to Atari to take a look at, and all of them were pretty shaky looking, I thought. I was in the R&D group at the time, and I was looking at them and asked to evaluate these 3 games, and they were okay, but one of them was Pac-Man, and no one had any knowledge of like the success that Pac-Man had already established in Japan, because it really launched and went huge in Japan. They even had coin shortages in the country of Japan because so many of the Pac-Man games had absorbed so many of the Japanese coins that it was becoming a national discussion point for them. And Pac-Man was a huge hit over there, but we were completely oblivious to it. And when they sent us a Pac-Man game and two others that were not as good, they said, look, Atari, we'd like to license the coin-op manufacturing rights for Pac-Man to you, but you got to take all three of these games, because it was a bundle deal. You couldn't just take one. And so anyway, someone up above sent these games over, and they said, well, take a look at them and tell us what you think. My assumption, or my assessment was, yeah, it's okay, it's not that great, you know. So if I were to fast forward about 30 years, I found myself working at Namco, and I was head of development at Namco Bandai, and there were a couple of guys there that remembered that I was the guy that gave a thumbs down to Pac-Man in the U.S. So that was one of those things you never live down.
I wanted to throw out something too, because the original question had been, did we get source code? So the last game I just mentioned, Tempest, was done by Atari, and so Dave Toyer and his group had done that. And so I did get their sources, which they start out to do things really, really rapidly. He'd done Battlezone before that. So basically he started with like Battlezone sources and then modified them to be Tempest. And it was a vector graphics game, so having it, I couldn't do any of the graphics stuff they did because we're doing bitmap, so it all had to be rewritten. But we used the same sound chip, so I got the actual sounds. So that's the biggest thing I got that we shared.
Bob Polaro, you put your initials in 2600 Defender. How long before Atari management discovered it, and were they upset about it?
They were never upset about it. In fact, shortly after that, it was almost mandatory to put an Easter egg in the game to help sell it, I guess. But yeah, you know, it was on the 25th wave. We hold the humanoid on the 25th line. All the aliens turned to BPs. But yeah, it took about 4 months or so before marketing found that. It was hard to keep it secret. Well, they didn't really like it, but they said, well, okay, I guess that's what we're going to do. And then you do a game and they say, what's your Easter egg? So,
Oh, sorry. Kind of was on my movie, so I don't know who the actual production company was, but who originally came up with the idea of ET for the 2600? Was it Atari or was it, I think, Custom? Warner Brothers, right?
You mean to do from movie to game?
Yeah, I mean, who came up, like, who was signed from Warner Brothers, or could you, once you asked them, they could do it?
There was generally a list.
Well, actually, the way that worked was the chairman of Warner Communications, a guy named Stephen Ross, Warner had a box seat at the ballpark in New York, and he was sharing. They were at a baseball game with Steven Spielberg, and Spielberg was pitching the idea of E.T. as a game to Stephen Ross, who was the chairman of Warner, and that was Atari's boss. So they're the ones that shook hands on the deal. And at the time, it was there was a couple of $1 million handshake that took place. I remember because it was $1 million a letter, and the deal kind of came down from above that we would have E.T. The game done in time for Christmas, no questions asked.
Yeah, I've heard Scott Warshaw talk about this, and basically he was instructed to meet a private jet at the airport in Monterey, was flown down to a meeting with Steven Spielberg, and I believe Ray Kassar was on the jet, and possibly Ross as well. And they kicked around the ideas of what it would be. And it's been commented in multiple press that it looks like a game that was developed in 6 to 8 weeks. It was developed in 5.5. And Scott was basically sequestered in his office. They brought him food. He slept there. He worked there. I think he went to the restroom.
Basically lived in his office during that time. That was a fun time.
Howard had intended to be here, but he wasn't able to make it. So I want to throw in an extra little one of his stories in that. So when he actually met Steven Spielberg, he actually accused Steven Spielberg of being an alien. And his rationale was that if you really were an alien species and you wanted to invade, the first thing you would probably want to do is get some good PR. And so putting out the alien, the third kind, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and E.T., they were nice aliens, and so he figured that was good PR for the invasion.
And then later, at the beginning of 1984, Amblin Entertainment was working on Gremlins. And it wasn't nearly the glitzy thing involved, but myself, Condon Brown, I think, and I forget who else went down there. Went down and talked with Steven about what we wanted to do for Gremlins, and the game ideas for both 5200 and the 2600 Gremlins came out of that meeting. And originally that was supposed to also be coordinated. There was a Coca-Cola, or a cola product called Like Cola. It was only around in some smaller regions of the country. They were planning to take that nationwide in a PR deal along with Gremlins and such. And we had a pretty tight timeline for that game as well, not nearly as tight as Howard's. But I released the ROMs for Gremlins 2 days before the Trammels took over. And the Trammels stopped all production of video games when they took control of the company.
That they did.
And I talked with Amblin Entertainment in the months following that, and they were really, really upset that this product had not gotten out. And they tried to buy the rights from the Trammels. They wouldn't sell. And I actually didn't realize that the game had ever made it to the store shelves until the first time I came to CGE. And John Hardy actually managed to procure a couple of copies for me. And I was really surprised to find out that myself and Bob Vieira and I'm spacing on the artist. Anyway, that we got box credit on that game, because that was something that never happened in the Atari that we were working for.
No, yeah, I had to risk my job for the box credit stuff. I always liked the way Activision was doing their, crediting the authors and stuff, and we weren't doing that at Atari at all. And so I was like, this is ridiculous. And so there was one guy in test who would proof all the manuals and the box mechanicals, and I said, you know what? Flag it as a bug if it doesn't have my name and Jerome Dormat's name on it, because he was the artist that did the title screen. And so every time the mechanicals would come back, he would go, your name's not there, or whatever. I go, you know what, flag it again. And then finally they put the name on the box. And I got some flack for it, and I was like, look, if you don't do it, I'm just gonna quit. And I'm just gonna go to Activision. Well, Activision doesn't know I was gonna go over there and try to get a job. So I ended up going to CES, telling the same story to the Chronicle reporter, and she actually posted that thing in the newspaper at the time, because that's what we had, were newspapers back then. And so that was always interesting to fall back onto. It was like, when I look back, it was like the first actual package that had our names on the back of it. And there's no way I would put my neck on one like that nowadays. But I had to segue from that because it just reminded me. I was like, oh yeah, that was a whole big issue.
So, I have a related story. So I did the coin-op Crystal Castles, and sort of separately, the 2600 Crystal Castles was developed
By Peter Nydane.
by Peter Nydane and Consumer. And well, I didn't really have anything to do with it, but somebody thought it would be good to put my name into the manual. So it actually says in the manual, printed, if you go to one of the original manuals, it says coin-op game by Franz Lanzinger, which is sort of a weird thing to do because I didn't do the entire game. I did a lot of it, but the credit really should have gone to the whole team. So somehow that sneaked in. But
Be happy I fought for that one name.
yeah, so it's probably because of you. But fast forward, recently Atari released on the Xbox, they re-released all the old 2600 games, or a lot of the old 2600 games on Xbox Live Arcade. And they have the manuals in there, but guess what? They pulled the credit to me.
Apparently those games are done by Atari. That's what it says.
It just, that line was at the bottom and it just kind of got magically removed. Strange
It was an
business.
accident, I'm sure.
Yeah, probably accident.
This wasn't a game that I worked on, but along the lines about employees at Atari not getting credit for games, and I heard some of these stories. So in, I believe it was Star Wars that Mike Halley worked on, they had hidden their names in such a way that they didn't show up unless you crank the brightness on the vector display to the max, and then you could see their names in there. But there's all kinds of stories like this, Atari employees wanting to get credit. And I was fortunate enough, by the time I got on there, we had a full screen with everyone's photo and names and everything. But it was a long time coming, and there were a lot of internal stories about the struggle for people who worked on these projects to get their names and representation.
Well, when Franz, you converted Tubin to the NES, and I remember when the first, Franz was very pro-credit, which I agree with. And so we looked at the screen, the credit screen, and it looked like the phone book. You had like everybody, and I think there were so many people that
No, there's only one really thing that stands out in my mind. So this was when I was working at Tengen, and my first project there was at Tengen was to do the NES version of Tumen. And at that time it was fine to have lots of credits, so I gave credit not just to the people who worked on it, but also to the composers of the classical music that's in there. And that did not sit well with management, because I don't know why, because movies give credit to classical composers. But they came up with, they said, oh, that takes up too much ROM, that takes up too much space, took like 30 bytes. And they told me to pull it out, and I sort of begrudgingly removed it because I didn't really care that much. But I thought it was kind of odd.
Yeah.
Who do you think the worst management was during the early Atari years? Do you think it was Andrade? Do you think it was Ray Kazan or Trammell's coming in? Which one was the, or
well, I mean, I don't know how the Trammell's managed, but I know when they came in, I was halfway through Garfield on the 2600, and then all of a sudden I got a knock on the door and I was done. So I was like, what? So I don't know how they managed. Prior to that, it was managed fine by me. Is that politically correct? I don't know.
I got some errors. Well, Ray, you have to understand that Ray Kazar came from Burlington Mills, so he had absolutely no concept. And marketing lived over at the corporate building, and there were a lot of bad habits. Let's just put it that way. They weren't really focused on games. They didn't care about games. They could have sold toilet paper for all they cared about them. So whenever you saw a group of marketing people coming over, it was not well thought of by the engineers. So yes, I would say that a lot of money got wasted from there. And at the time, Atari paid me $16,500 a year to do video pinball. They probably grossed, what, 40 million? And most of that went to the execs. I think I got a $6,000 bonus there. But the rest of it, all of that, we're getting.
Yeah, I remember when Ray Kazar and his entourage came into the back of Atari, because I worked in the back, nobody knew what I was doing, and that was great. And came back one time, and they needed to see, they were like, it's kind of like show and tell, everybody would show what project they're working on. And so I was just kind of learning the 2600, so I was working on the Goofy Quadron game. And so I had all these colors flashing and everything, and sounds and stuff. And I'm showing him the game, and he's in a suit, he's right behind me like that, and I'm playing it for a little bit, and I kind of look over like this, and he looks at me, and he goes, colorful. And that was it. I turned, about 6 people turned and left. Like,
One of the other things was that many of us felt that the marketing department didn't really understand how to deal with original content. There were a lot of different things that were tried and would get canned. Zari Arena was one of those. Zari Arena went through 2 rounds of focus testing with significant changes after the first round. The second round, it came out with really strong likes. And then they sent it out to the malls for playtesting. And it was, their methodology was they would show 3 games for a limited amount of time, and then they would basically say, well, would you buy them at these price points, etc. And the games that Zari Arena were up against, one was Robotron 2084, and I don't remember what the other one was that was playtested, but it was another arcade conversion.
Defender.
It was Defender. I don't know, yeah, I'm not really sure. It actually may have been. But it was 2 top flight arcade game conversions. And the confidence score that they needed was like a 6, and it came in at 5.7, and so it was canceled.
The focus groups were a huge component in game development back then. I mean, I would get stacks of information back from a focus group where, it's like these 12-year-old girls are playing this space game, which was Quadron, and why isn't it like Miss Pac-Man? And, I mean, I'm just going through reams of this data, trying to figure out what am I going to do here, and so they just created a mail order only game, and just figured they would sell 10,000 of them. But
One thing to remember is that in the early days of games and game development, nobody had any experience. You couldn't go out and hire an experienced game programmer because there weren't any. Back in the kind of middle 70s, everyone that came into the company didn't have any game experience, so that was true for marketing people. They were trying to extrapolate experience from some other business into creating what was a very immature business and industry at that time. In the earlier days, we didn't really have a good sense that this was actually going to continue to be a real ongoing thing. Like, video games might be just a passing fad. They're going to be, they were big last Christmas, but they might fall down next Christmas, and the public will be on to something else. It really wasn't until kind of the 80s that I started thinking, gee, maybe there's a future in this. But from the manager standpoint, the original leaders, the Nolan Bushnell and Joe Keenan and those guys, they had a tremendous amount of chutzpah to push people to make things happen, and literally no one knew. It wasn't according to a grand scheme. There wasn't a great strategy. There wasn't a giant guiding vision. Everyone was making it up as we go. And so a lot of things were experimented with. A lot of things didn't work. Fortunately, a few things, continually came out that did work that allowed it to keep going. I really enjoy working with Nolan, but he had his downside too in terms of being somebody that he would come into. You'd have a meeting and you'd talk about, okay, we're going to do this game, and it's going to be like that. And then he'd sign off on it, and a week later he'd be back in the labs talking to somebody, changing it all without anyone else knowing it. So there was an awful lot of that kind of misdirection and miscoordination that made it challenging to work there. But the upside was that it was something new every day.
If you worked quick enough, like while somebody was being dealt with over on that side of the building, you could hide away and do stuff over here, so it's kind of like a shuffle game. Yeah.
What do you guys think of the contributions made by GCC in the 5200? Were they perceived as outsiders or something to the company?
Well, personally for me, my first experience with GCC, and they do great work, by the way, and so Dan Hitchens, who did Berserk and Sword Quest and a lot of games, was my manager, and he said, Steve, we both actually decided to do Battlezone for the Atari 2600, and I was like, oh, this is going to be awesome. I'd love to do that. So he just got married. He was going on his honeymoon. So I started working on stuff. I had a Vector-looking kind of hill going on and everything, and I was like 2 weeks into it, and I walked into Richard Frick's office, and I look at the screen and I see a finished Battlezone game on the Atari 2600, and I was like frozen, and I kind of stared at it. I said, hey Richard, what's going on here? Oh yeah, this just came in from GCC, and I was like, oh wow. I'm not sure how I'm going to explain this to Dan when he gets back from his honeymoon, and tell him that our game's already done, but we didn't do it. And they did a nice version of it. I wanted to go the Vector route, have it look that way, but that was my first real personal experience with GCC, and I knew all their stuff was really good that came in, and but I think I may have strayed from that.
So I actually wanted to say something positive about what they did. We worked very much independently, one person, two people at a time on a game. GCC actually put a team on it, and they have a number of people working, and then they had some of their senior members that would do some of the hard stuff, and so they would share and culture, and so they cranked things out pretty rapidly, and I thought pretty decent quality. Now, I wasn't really keen on it being the competition, but I remember showing up at CES, I think in Chicago, and in the booth there were these people from Atari Boston. It's like, and it's
Boston.
Yeah, I'm going, what? Where in Boston? It's like, no, they would not say they were from GCC, but yes.
Yeah, I did all my work on the 5200, and GCC was, they had a little bit of there was some negative concerns around the office, because whereas the Atari programmers on the 2600 would be given a specific ROM budget, for example, Pac-Man was limited to 2K, even though Todd wanted a lot more for it. And the folks at GCC basically would go ahead and do whatever it needed for the game, and then they would present the finished product to Atari, and Atari would say, "Oh, okay." And so, the Todd's version of Pac-Man with the always flickering ghosts and such was an artifact of not having enough ROM. And the GCC Ms. Pac-Man was essentially what Todd was wanting to do with the screen kernels.
And it's not just because they created Ms. Pac-Man in the first place?
No, it's because basically these guys can tell you a lot more about the 2600 programming, but basically in order to get the complexity of the screen, be able to have the code to multiplex the players as necessary when they were on a line together, but not multiplex them when they were in other parts of the maze. That's stuff that it takes multiple copies of code very similar to each other, but not exactly, and that takes extra ROM space.
Plus, he was the first one paving the way for this stuff, so it was all knowledge, and we were all learning from each other. So obviously, and it's still true to this day, as you keep doing this stuff, and you see the stuff that looks better and better. May not necessarily play better and better, but
Yeah, and then it came down to the 5200 had problems with its controllers and it wasn't selling all that well. And this thing called the 7800 came out of GCC. And there was a, internal to Atari, it was being perceived as, oh, this is going to replace the 5200. It's a better system. And it was different. It could do certain kinds of games better than the 5200, but there were whole classes of games it couldn't do because it didn't have the bitmap support.
yeah, I mean, basically we just didn't know what GCC was doing. If we knew that, it would be fine. Okay, they're doing that, then I'll do this and whatever. And but we never knew what they were doing. You had a question?
Yes, this question for Mr. Hightower. I take it that you grew up playing the original Atari games when you were younger, before you went over to Atari. Did you feel that when you actually got a job at Atari, did you feel like you were continuing the legacy of it, or because the company was so far removed from the original version of it that it seemed more like a, it seemed positive, but it wasn't as dramatic as
No, when I started at Atari Coin-Op, I had wanted to work on coin-op games for quite some time. And, the first arcade game I played was Asteroids, and I was a big Asteroids player and lined up the ships and got all kinds of attention when I was a kid. And that was great. And I always, since that moment, I played a lot of other games and got really good at them. And, everybody in my school kind of knew me as the arcade game, the guy that could play all the different arcade games. So I actually got my first real, I did a short little thing. I'll try and answer your question more directly. I guess it would go too long, but I worked for Paradigm Simulation, which became Paradigm Entertainment. We got a gig with Nintendo, and we were contracted to do Pilotwing 64. And that product was successful enough that I got calls from recruiters saying, "What do you want to do?" And I told them, I was like, "I want to do an arcade driving game." And I really expected that they were going to say, "That's really cool, but you're going to need to move to Japan and work with, Sega." And I was really prepared to do that. But the recruiter says, "I actually have a deal with Atari." I'm like, "Atari, aren't they out of business?" And, "No, let me just have this guy call you and we'll let him talk to you." And so John Ray called me from Atari. And I just got back from E3 and I actually had the chance to play San Francisco Rush, which Ed Logg, who created Asteroids, had actually implemented the Nintendo 64 version of San Francisco Rush. So it was one of the early Nintendo 64 games to come out. And so when I played it, I kind of recognized that it had the hard drive and model in there. And I asked John Ray, I was like, "Is that the hard drive and model?" He's like, "Yeah. Wow, that's really cool." And so they brought me in for the interview, and I got to meet Ed Logg and Dave Shepard. Dave Shepard made the Asteroids Deluxe game, and all of these guys that are just heroes and legends to me. I mean, I did the whole Wayne's World. I'm not worthy. When I met Ed Logg, it was just so great. And so for me, I really did want to do my best to carry the torch for all of Coin-Op, and that's really where my passions lie, and to this day. It was a great opportunity to work with those guys that had been there for 20 plus years. I was there for just a year or so, and we had the 25th anniversary, and we took a big boat onto the Bay Area, and so and all those guys that have been there, and then getting to work with Franz and all of these legends. To me, that was just absolutely fantastic. So yeah, I always kind of was like the new guy and everything. But even when I was at working with Nintendo and these guys, they all thought I was just crazy. Arcades are dead and Coin-Op are But that that really was my thing. So yeah, it was great. It was really everything that I imagined. And it's a little sad that it didn't continue going on, but it was fantastic. And thanks for the question.
Yeah, I was, before I started at Atari, I was also addicted to Asteroids, the original one. One of the fun things we had in the office, in the consumer division, was we had a couple of areas, rooms set aside with the arcade machines, many of which were being looked at for conversions. but others were just in there for research. And go up and blow off some steam, we'd go in there, but people would get too good at things like Defender or Tempest or whatever, to be able to really, if you started playing and just kept playing, you'd spend way too much time at it. So they came up with ways of making them more difficult, like covering up the entire screen of Defender except for the little meter at the top and play instrument flight rules. And I forget what some of the other ones were that we did that way. Just mutant training mission on Defender, where go down and shoot all the people first.
Just an add-on in the coin-op side, the rooms that the games were being developed in weren't personal, dedicated to one game. They were the labs, they were called. And Ed Log had his Asteroids game sitting there, and there was about 6 or 7 feet away on the same bench would be another game, and then another game down there, and another one behind him, and whichever one was starting to be played by the other guys, and then the word would get out that people would come in from from other parts of the office to come in and see that game, and pretty soon, as Ed couldn't work on Asteroids anymore because everyone's playing his station all the time, that's when they knew, hey, this is going to be good.
Just another word about Ed Log. He's still known as the programming god. He is absolutely the best I've ever seen. When I arrived at Atari, I was but an egg, and I read his code for a long time. Learned an amazing amount.
I want to say one more thing about Ed Log too. He was the coin-op guru over there, but he actually did a 2600 game. I think it was backgammon, and I remember when he was
Actually,
working on it. It was what? Othello, okay. It was one of those board games. But he said it was the hardest project he's ever worked on. I mean, compared to all the coin-op games he did.
But when he was done with it, he put it head to head with someone's competing Othello game, and of course his game trounced the other one.
And one more thing about focus groups is they tested one game I did called Bugs Bunny with, they tested it with 10 to 16-year-olds along with Snoopy and the Red Baron, and you could kind of guess which game they preferred to play. So they shoved Bugs Bunny down, and I said, I think you play tested it with the wrong age group.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, in the early days of coin-op, they basically made a game that just threw it in a cabinet. Wood grain, very simple cabinet. And later on, as things got more sophisticated, the cabinet and art was a very integral design to game frequently. And one cabinet in particular is Crystal Castles. I mean, that's just gorgeous. That's one of the prettiest cabinets out there. In fact, I bought it, even if it didn't work, I had to have the cabinet. And then I worked to get the game working. So now I've got a great game, a great cabinet, and I got the cocktail one. I didn't care about that because I want the whole effect of the flashing red trackball in the big original cabinet. Did the artist come in later and then wrap art around the game, or was it a co-design between the programmer and the artist? How did all that work at that time?
I guess I should answer that.
Yeah.
So the brief history is Crystal Castles took about a year and a half from start to being in the arcade. And for the first year or so, it was just the programmer and the engineers working on the game. There was really no involvement by the manufacturing and the cabinet designers. Once the game was basically approved for production, that's when they came in, and it was really quite separate. They took the artwork from the game, and they of course had to redo the artwork because it was all vector-based and much more detailed than what's in the arcade game. But yeah, I agree with you. They did a really good job making that cabinet, and especially the flashing trackball. I always like that a lot. And I still have my Crystal Castles game at home, and recently got it fixed. I needed a new monitor. By the way, it's really hard to get those monitors. They are getting harder to find because everything's at least LCD now. So get your arcade games fixed now while you can.
Let's see. Well, wow. 3D pointer here. Let's see. I think he got you. Oh, no, you.
Me.
In the middle row.
When you guys were developing, especially the early games, how much of the initial development was on paper versus how much of it was just kind of like seat of your pants development as you were coding it?
For me, it was just kind of start putting stuff up on the screen, and the only time the paper really came into play is when actually doing the artwork with a pencil, and just you have the grid paper, and then taking the hex from that, and boom, there's a hamburger.
In the early days, the art for the game was those white dots on black screens, right? So typically a graphic race car or cowboy or something would be drawn by filling in squares on a piece of grid paper, and you would create that was also known as programmer art. When the technology got allowed for higher resolution is when you were able to use more formally trained artists and that sort of thing. It was one of the things I worked on was Battlezone. Ed Rodberg was the guy that had the first 3D vector graphic game, but he asked me to come up with a way to design the tanks and the graphics, basically all the characters. And it was really hard because there were no paint programs. There wasn't any supporting technology for artists at all. So we literally, I had to lay it out in three-dimensional views in order to find the intersecting points in space to make the tank work. And there was a lot of invention that was necessary to sort of make these things happen because there was no prior art.
There was, we had some graph paper that had been printed out on some large sheets that had timing diagrams showing where horizontal blank occurred, how many clock cycles here, and basically have down, the graph paper was down to the color clock cycle so that we could, you have the right proportion of the pixels and such. I know I used that when developing or drawing the play field for real sports soccer. Basically, I sat down and figured out what the projections were and got the coordinates, and then of course, it was actually drawn with by line drawing of the game. But it was all done on paper first. There were other concept arts that was done just trying to figure out what you were going to do on the screen. Today you do that in a paint program, just draw it out. And, I think it'll look like this. But back then, getting the pixels on the screen was one of the hardest things to do. You were often having to write code to do it.
Yeah, so another thing people think is that you would write a design document first and get your game design all squared away in a large document. And nowadays, a lot of games are made that way, and even 10 or 20 years ago. But 30 years ago, we also had a little bit of paper at the beginning, so there would be brainstorming sessions, and there would be somebody would write up what the idea was. Maybe one sheet would say, "Oh, we're going to have a tank, and it's going to shoot." Some very, very low level of detail. But then, once the programmers started, it would really be seat of the pants most of the time.
I wanted to add one thing about this too. One of the really important things about most of these guys worked on the 2600, and you were really limited to how much you could display on a line-by-line basis. So the really important thing was the actual kernel lines for doing these things. So you didn't get a lot of chance to design. You were basically worrying what you could do just from almost a line-to-line basis, and depending upon if someone else would come out with an extra character type kernel or something like that. So it really was, what can I do now? It was really on the fly for most of these guys.
Yeah, and the 2600, everything was based on screen kernel. The 5200, you had a lot of much better graphics support, but there were still things that we ran screen kernels. I don't think I wrote a 5200 game that didn't have a screen kernel. At least things ran on displayless interrupts.
Can I add one more thing here? Actually, every time I do a project, I buy a quadrille notebook. So I have my notebooks dating back to video pinball.
Oh, wow. Put those
and
online.
the first thing I had to do with video pinball, of course, was, the play field had 4-pixel resolution. So I definitely had to lay my screen out because it was very, very important. And of course, all of my kernels, I always worked kernel. In fact, I'm working on a 2600 cartridge right now that's up to 8K, but it's not done yet. And I wrote the kernels in a quadrille notebook. And so I have page after page of kernels with machine cycle count next to them, because that, 76 cycles and you get 22 and a third in horizontal blank, and you just have to obey. So yes, I was the kind of person who did work from paper first. I don't do so much anymore when I'm working on other pieces of hardware, but for the 2600 it was essential. Bob Polaro was more a seat of the pants guy.
So we have this poor guy down here.
Right there.
Yeah, my question is, because Atari Got Pac-Man, all the select original said remarketing the original games for an iPad, but what is the process where, a great company that everyone admires and has original ideas, what is the evolutionary process to where it becomes a company with this name and capable of
I don't know if this answers your question. This may be coin-op specific, but one of the other things that Atari had a history of doing was having these off-site meetings where they would have brainstorming sessions. So I'm pretty sure that Centipede is an example of a coin-op game that originated from a brainstorming session. So I think some of the ideas that were culminated and agreed upon, as worthy to move forwards on, started from those sessions.
Are you saying current day Atari? Is that what you're saying about doing original? Yeah, I don't know what's going on there.
Yeah, I don't.
It's a very, very different company.
people like me on the iPad.
Oh, right.
It's in the original Atari game.
Yeah.
And that's about it. It's like, I can't remember when they come up with the
Oh.
original idea that was actually good.
Is there anybody here that works at Atari right now that could answer that?
They were the publishers of Ghostbusters in 2009, and I don't know if they've done a lot of games that are considered to be original intellectual property. They didn't make a revamp of Mars Revenge.
Yeah, how did that turn out? I didn't play that one.
I tried a demo. It looks nothing like yours original.
Is it fun though?
No, not really.
Well,
I will say the sort of the process.
Yeah, I don't know what their process is now.
Well, I don't know what the current process is, but I would say that kind of looking at the overall arch of what happened with Atari. Originally, it was a startup, and it had passionate people that were excited about trying to create things that were completely new and different. And as it grew and became a multi-billion-dollar business, it became more heavily influenced by the marketplace and by professional business managers who didn't really have that same gut level appreciation for the games themselves. And as the founders left the company, it more or less became owned by the professional business managers who wound up, I'm not going to tell the story, but ultimately collapsing the company. And now it exists as a form of intellectual property. So the name, the games that were created, the intellectual property of Atari is what ultimately got resurrected by a whole new group of people, and they're exploiting it, or they're taking it into the marketplace. But Atari was kind of dead for a long time, but it's come back because I think of the value of its intellectual property.
Glenn, you had a question?
Yeah, sure did. past keynotes, there's mention of the game that was done in-house. I think it was Larry Kaplan did it, called Marketing Adventure. And basically it was a game where you basically had to run around, you had to collect a pie, you had to find the golden disc, you had to get across the street. And basically the bottom line of the game was you could not win because you could not win against marketing. Just kind of wondering, if any of you ever got to play that, and if you did you use that with any of the new programmers that teach them a lesson before they really got?
I've never seen that.
That was actually one of the tests.
I never saw that.
There was an adventure interpreter that was written for BASIC, and virtually every new programmer, at least in the 2600 area, knocked one of these out. I did Sleazy Adventure, which later went out with Dale Yoakum's.
What was it called?
Sleazy Adventure. I won't go into details, but Marketing Adventure was one of those. And Dennis Coble did a puzzle box that you had to walk through. It was interesting. I believe that it went out, I cannot remember, Dale Yoakum decided that there was a lot of software floating around that for the 800. And it was low-ditch software. I just can't remember what he called it. And yes, it did hit the market. I'm not sure if Sleazy Adventure made it. It was kind of R-rated. But the Adventure Interpreter, I think, did.
I actually wanted to say something more since you mentioned Larry Kaplan, and it kind of impacts on a couple of other questions that have been asked previously. So there were questions about quality, for instance, at one point, and I thought one of the real telling things was that we considered Ray Kassar and them to be bean counters, and they were always concerned about how much ROM we would have because you'd pay extra money to get a cartridge out that had more storage in it. But when Activision went away, they paid attention to what you needed to do to get good graphics. And so they would actually have things that look better because they give you the resources to do that. And so when Larry came back to manage us, I thought finally we're saved because we'll have someone that knows the resources we need. And I was quite surprised when we got sold the Dremels and went out of business. But
yeah.
I guess this is a question for each one. What is your favorite game that you worked on, whether it was released or not?
Oh, okay.
I'm gonna have to say probably my favorite game that I worked on myself was the first one that I worked on. It was called Ultimate Wizard, and I wrote a construction set for that when I was kind of a kid, and I was lucky enough to have it published by Electronic Arts. It was kind of a Jumpman clone for Commodore 64, and I just wrote a letter to some guys that wrote the original code and trying to hack together a construction set and turn it into a production thing. So that was really my fondest memory because I was still a kid, and it was a lot of fun for me to do.
So my favorite is Miss Pac-Man for the NES, which I did for Tengen back in 1990 in just 5 months. And just recently found out the true story behind Miss Pac-Man. Steve Golson is going to be talking tomorrow. Gave a really great talk about it about a week ago at California Extreme, and I finally found out a little bit about the history. It's very, very interesting. But at the time when I worked on it, I just knew there was this Miss Pac-Man game that I liked, and I was not given the source code. I was just given an arcade game in my cubicle and a little rigged up pause button so I could pause the game and look at the graphics frame by frame, and I transferred the graphics pixel by pixel by hand. And started by doing a straight port and then adding a whole bunch of stuff. And the best part was adding all the new stuff, the new mazes and multiplayer and various weird new features. So I really enjoyed doing that.
Well, Video Pinball was probably my biggest seller. The best thing about that was we showed it at the first CES, and the Fantastic Four, which is what we call the Activision boys, came over, kind of looked at it, and said, "Okay, he can do this." So that made me a member of the club. So that was a good thing. But I think Dragonfire was the one I liked the most. I actually got a mention in IEEE Spectrum, which is a magazine for electrical engineers, about my kernels. So that felt real good.
I think my favorite Atari game that I worked on probably was Battlezone, mostly because it was it was very challenging to come up with ways to make something work that really hadn't been done like that, and it was very exciting when people saw it working for the first time. Because at the time, now today it looks it looks pretty old, but when it first came out, it was thought of as very cool, and I enjoyed working on it.
For different reasons, I'd say, to give you two answers. One would be Gremlins, and the other would be Atari Arena. Gremlins had a really good sort of feel about it all the way through the project. It had a good kickoff with Steven Spielberg, and it was a nicely polished game that sort of captured a lot of the humor of the movie. Atari Arena was actually formed, just sort of came to me at one of those offsite meetings where we were discussing what the next video game console would be. That never ended up happening. And I sat down and figured out how to do some of the graphic stuff that really had never been done before. At one point I diverge here a little bit. The Atari 800 had 4 player objects, which technically meant you had 4 sprites. I figured out how to make 16 sprite objects, the fireballs in Atari Arena, be pretty much look like 16 independent sprites. And at one point during when I was proving out the technology, I had up to about 64 of them on the screen at one time. So there were a lot of challenges that I had to get through on that. Created an entirely different way of doing music on the device. There's just a lot of things came together on it that I really, really enjoyed doing on that.
Yeah, several that for different reasons that I liked. I mean, Quadrant was my first game, my first experience with the Atari 2600, but it didn't make it to the store shelves. And then Taz was cool for me because it was the first one to make it to the store shelves for me. I thought that was a big thrill. Garfield would have been nice because that was the first time I had an 8-character kernel going with only red's color changes for all you nerds out there. You know what I'm talking about. But Kid Chameleon for the Sega Genesis. And one that didn't get released, which was complete, was Saturn Waterworld. Which I'm really bummed about that to this point in time.
Well, there's a difference between the most lucrative game or the most game I'm most proud of. So if I were to pick one game, it would actually be something I designed about 20 years ago on the Commodore 64 called World Geography, which teaches geography to kids in kind of drill and practice kind of format. And then I converted it to the Apple II, and then it was ended up being a Java applet game for an internet website. And then more recently I did it for the BlackBerry smartphone, and I did it for the Android smartphone, which is more rare.
See that?
You can see it. See the letters on it. Then I did it for the Nook tablet and a few other tablets. So basically I've been working on the same game for about 20 years.
Well, I guess my favorite would be Good Luck Charlie Brown. Never made it out. It was one of those games that was almost done in 1984, and the Tramiels came and said no games. That was the end of that. My cousin did get a prototype copy that I guess has gone onto the market. And It was just a different game. I didn't have some of the trials and tribulations that the other folks had. The special projects group started with 8K cartridges. We never had to deal with lesser memory, and so it was always fun in those days to have people think you were doing a 5200 game and reassure them, no, this is a 2600 game. And so it had a good look, and it was different play, and Charles Schulz loved it, so what more could you ask for? It was a great thing that just never made it out.
So I think the one I was most happy with was Real Sports Baseball. When you're a little kid starting out to learn how to play baseball and you get to first base, you just want to run. You don't know that you shouldn't go to second base now because the pitcher's got the ball. So when I started adding the computer logic, I had that problem. And so as you trained it to be better, it's like you felt like the parent that's gotten it to be better. So I thought it was pretty good. We did play testing in Chicago, and I remember sitting behind that mirror while these adults are talking about, I wish the Cubs played this well. That made me feel pretty good. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, as designers, how much attention was paid to what other designers were doing on that same platform at that same time? Was it like a competitive thing, like, oh, he did that, I want to see if I can do better? Or?
Well, in the Atari 2600 group, at least.
Not specifically the 2600, but yeah.
Well, I mean, you mean in general back in the Atari time, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Well, we were in separate buildings, but I can only speak for the building I was in, which was in 275 Gibraltar, where we did those games. We got to go across the street. But I always felt that we always tried to share and help each other. Like if somebody needed a kernel to do something different, nobody was like hoarding anything.
Well, like, what about what you're seeing, like what Magic and Activision's doing?
Oh, yes, that's different. Yes, I was asked to take an iMagic card and reverse engineer it and borrow code, and I totally refused to do it. You know, I said I am not going to do it. I mean, I know these guys. Indirectly, I'd never really met all of them, but I said I can't do that. And it may have been Bob's game that they wanted me to take apart, and I just said I can't do that. You know, we're not going to do that. And so, I really didn't look at anybody else's stuff. I mean, I did as a player playing it.
Or
and stuff.
look at other people's things and admire what they've done, and then try to do something better. Not really.
Well, maybe subliminally you're doing that. You're like trying to make something more addicting or something. Compelling.
We did have, there was,
I'd say it was really...
There was a gentleman, Chris Powell, that was actually, his job there was as the software librarian. And he would try and curate specific routines that could be used and reused in the games, both 2600 and 5200, and documenting some of the key tricks of that these guys came up with on the 2600. So there was an actual effort within the consumer division of Atari to try and promote sharing. We didn't really have source control systems or anything like that, but I always found it a very open and inviting environment to work in.
I think it was competitive, but it was that pure academic kind of competition where it's, oh, see what I did? You said this couldn't be done. Well, here it is. And there was a lot of that, and that was what was shared around. And you always wanted to do the same thing with fewer bytes or fewer cycles or just better.
I don't think it was competitive, but it was more critical in that you would play other people's games and make suggestions on how to make it better, and everything was shared that way. But you wouldn't give them code.
So I have a couple of comments in general.
You didn't, maybe.
I don't know about the older game, maybe representing just my personal experiences more recently, but going back to one of the questions about Atari Corp versus Atari Games, there's actually, Atari split Atari Corps and Atari Games. When I was at Paradigm, I left Paradigm to move to work with experienced game designers that have been making games that I knew were really good for a long time. And my personal aspiration and competitiveness, and certainly, looking backwards at Paradigm. Paradigm was definitely focused on, we want to make as much money as possible. We want to be commercially successful. We're nobody in the industry. That's certainly one measure. But another measure for me personally is, did you make something that everybody wants to play? And so we talk about Ed Log, and just one random thing that he did was Tengen Tetris. Okay, now this thing, got stomped on by Nintendo because maybe it was too good, but they told him you can't make these anymore. But that was a fantastic game, and I think a lot of the people that I personally admire, focus more on the overall addictive nature of the game and a measure of success maybe a little bit beyond the financial aspects, but how does it integrate into culture? What's the relevance from a broader point of view? And I think, a lot of the people that were at Atari had this capability to kind of transcend, like, okay, well, we sold a bunch of them, maybe we did some trick or whatever and made some money, but made things where people like really took notice, like, this is a really great game, and I don't know why, but I can't stop playing it, and it's awesome. And who made this? Oh yeah, this same guy made this great game, made that great game. And I think also goes to kind of some of the desire to have credits that, a lot of these people are doing really good jobs, wish that people knew who they were, and maybe the corporation didn't want that. But when you talk about, what inspires you and everything, I'm only speaking for myself, but I see this in other developers who want to make great games just to satisfy their own desire to do something meaningful.
One other quick comment on that was that actually my involvement with Countermeasure came out of that very same kind of thing, where Leo Salinas had basically finished it, but it was not quite, didn't have quite the, all the pieces that he wanted in it, and he didn't know what to add to it. And I was talking with him about it, and came up with some concepts of missiles and how to change the flight paths and such. And so basically the management said, well, why don't you go in and help him on that and build that in. In my little blurb in the thing here, they put in that I designed Countermeasure. No, I didn't design Countermeasure, but I got definitely some of the credit for it, but not certainly not all of it.
Yeah.
I am. I'm an idiot, but I am. Pardon me?
How does it feel to be going back?
Well, I'm working on an emulator. Obviously, I don't have the same crude development systems that we used at Atari. I mean, we had thermal paper printers. That was the kind of, we were actually using a PDP. But that's and a line-oriented editor. We didn't have fancy things like screen editors. But yes, counting out machine cycles, and it was actually a game that I had started on the 800 in the last days of the Magic, which when we ran out of money, and that was it for any code we were doing. And I've been wanting to do the game for years, and I won't talk about it yet. But yes, it was fun, and the emulator is wonderful. Normally on the 2600, when you stop the development system, what you see are streaks on the screen, because the way a 2600 screen is generated is by actually changing the graphics registers as the beam goes across the screen. So when you stop it, all you get is the last things you wrote into those graphic registers all the way down. Whereas, the new emulator, boy, you can breakpoint on any scan line, you can look at any of the registers that used to be write only. Now you can read them back. Oh, that's what I wrote to it, or that's what it contained on that particular scan line. So it's been great fun, and of course, I dreamed 6502. I mean, I know 6502 so well, and I know all the machine cycle counts of every single instruction. So it was like it was a blast to the past.
Steve, you mentioned you worked at the Gibraltar building, and you were there when the Tremelos came, Leonard, and...
Well, we moved to Milpitas, and then they came to Milpitas, but yeah.
I was just curious, do you know who made that PA announcement when they walked in, and was sure that everyone got fired?
I was working on Garfield in an office with the door shut, got a door knock, took my headphones that we were bought. And I just figured, no big deal. That means we're going to continue working. And then it was about a week later, I think, something like that.
We got rid of about 75% of engineers, and kept the rest of us on as contract.
I was asked, do I want to do games? And I said, yeah, and then I was gone. I don't know. I mean, that's what happened to me.
Yeah. No, it's the actual question about when they actually came into the building and the PA announced that the stormtroopers have arrived.
Yeah.
What was the exact phrase?
I don't know what the date was.
Have entered the building.
And so
that did happen.
It did happen. Yes. We didn't have the dun 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 that, but we had the announcement. Yeah.
Do you know who made that?
Not me.
I would always think of Howard if I thought of something like that.
Might have been.
For what it's worth, in the ups and downs of the business, and in the 83, 84 time frame, when much of the industry was kind of collapsing and falling apart, and Atari had, I remember there were 72 different buildings that they were occupying in the Santa Clara County area, and so there was a very large company. There was a lot of stuff, a lot of people in different places. And when it came time to close some of these things down, there was an established history of, I think it probably came from Ray, but shutting whole buildings down. And that had happened actually a bunch of times. And that's kind of, they just chop things off. Yeah.
Technically, do you find it funny that technically there's a part of a full cycle coming around when you have Warner Brothers buying what remained of Midway and becoming Warner Brothers Games when they're owning the intellectual property of Atari Games? I mean,
There's no end to the irony of the video games business. If you just stick around long enough, the people that were killing you before, you wind up owning them later. And it just happens, it's happened over and over again.
Did you know the answer to the stormtrooper one?
Yeah. Yeah. It was over at
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, just my memory of the shutdown there was we basically got told that this was happening, and I had known some people that were working at Atari that had worked at Commodore before, so I'd heard tales of the Tremels. And I basically told the management that, I don't want to work for these people. So, whether it was going to be in games or on their future products, I said, no, I don't want to work for them.
Yeah.
You had mentioned something about finishing up Tempest for the 2600.
Oh.
Yes. So actually, what happened is that's what I was working on when we quit working on games, and I had one of these 8-inch floppy disks of one of my previous backups, and I actually gave it to John Hardy to put in the museum. And unbeknownst to me, he actually gave it to Kurt Vendel. I think he wound up with the guys from Atari Age, and Ken Van Mersberger had then emailed me to say Atari Age was going to resurrect this game. Would I help with it? And so Ken and Dennis, someone started on it, and the next thing I know, I got the code and I wind up finishing it. But it's been long and painful. Yes. Well,
we're just about done with time here, so if there's one more question.
Well, I'll just finish that question real quick. So I told them the game was done, so they could do it at the show here, but Atari Age is not here. They will be at the Northwest Retro Gaming Conference in Portland next month. It will be there, I believe.
And a lot of, if you guys want to continue reading about the history or hearing about it, Marty Goldberg and Kurt Vendel have a pretty good book that's going to cover a lot of that stuff. When will that be available, you think?
It should be anything like that.
End of next week? And it's Atari Business is Fun?
Yeah, Atari.
Atari Inc. Business is Fun. Plug there.
Well, thank you all. I don't see any more hands. Stand up and shout. Thank you very much.